Spontaneous human combustion. The phenomenon where people just suddenly burst into flames without an external source of ignition. Basically, what would have happened to George Carlin if he walked into a church.
That there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And he needs money. He's all powerful, all perfect, all knowing, and all wise. Somehow, just can't handle money.
As of today, there have been about 200 recorded cases of possible spontaneous human combustion, with the first of those cases dating all the way back to the 13th century. And although quite rare, this phenomenon has been well documented. Now, in almost every single case, the victim is reduced to a pile of ashes, and their surroundings were left mostly undamaged. So how, in the blue hell, is that possible? Well, it seems that those science nerds may finally have the answer. The prevailing theory is that spontaneous human combustion is impossible, and what is most likely happening can be called the Wick effect. That's right, John Wick just came and f***ed them all up. No, it's something ignites them and then they just burn like a candle. Hence, the Wick effect. So now, in order to understand what might actually be happening, let's take a look at a handful of cases to get a feel for what we're dealing with today. As always, discretion is advised. The earliest written record of spontaneous human combustion was in 1663, when a Danish doctor and mathematician named Thomas Bartholin tried to explain the very strange death of a knight named Polonius Vorstius. Named Polonius Vorstius. Named this. Apparently, Polony was in Milan drinking some really strong wine with his parents when suddenly he burped fire and was consumed by the flames, as evidenced by this very real photograph. Another strange account takes us to 1725, when a Parisian innkeeper named Jean Millet found the remains of his wife Jean Lemaire in the kitchen of their inn. She was now a pile of ashes. How he knew it was her is a complete mystery. Well, I guess he couldn't find her anywhere else after that, so that might explain it. Oddly enough though, despite the fact that his wife was basically cremated, the wooden utensils around her in the kitchen were unburned. The authorities then came over and immediately thought that this guy killed his wife, and they found him guilty of murder. However, they just couldn't really prove it because there was no evidence. Apparently, when Jean Millet appealed his conviction, he claimed that this crime was due to a visitation from God. He won his appeal. Fuck you, Ed and Lorraine Warren. But the locals still thought this dude killed his wife. Soon after all of this drama, a famous surgeon named Claude Nicolas Lecat came round and said, quote, "I have solved the problem. It was actually spontaneous human combustion. Sacre bleu!" Anyway, moving on. Another case from 1885 mentions how a victim named Matilda Rooney suddenly burst into flames on Christmas Eve. Apparently, she was relaxing and drinking whiskey that evening, and then at some point she went into the kitchen and just burst into flames, and this fire quickly incinerated her entire body except for her feet. According to reports, her husband Patrick also died from this incident, but from smoke inhalation. When the police came over to inspect the scene, they were completely baffled. There was no signs of foul play, no signs to suspect anyone had attacked the couple, no signs of what could have even started the fire, despite the fact that this fire was able to reduce Matilda to ashes and leave only a few fragments of bone, and it had not spread to the rest of the room. The fire seemingly started in her body and stayed in her body. So the police just chalked this one up to spontaneous human combustion. Now, the next strange case I want to mention happened in Pennsylvania in 1966. On December 5th, a meter reader named Don Gosnell let himself into the home of Dr. John Irving Bentley. Dr. Bentley was a 92-year-old physician who wasn't in the best of health. Therefore, Don actually had permission to enter his home to do the meter readings, unlike Thomas Boyer from the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. What a cunt. But I digress. Now, Don enters Bentley's home and he goes straight to the basement to check the meter. Now, while in the basement, Don notices a strange smell and a light blue smoke. He would later explain the smell of the smoke to be somewhat sweet, like starting up a new oil-burning central heating system. Oddly specific, but on the ground was a neat pile of ashes about 14 inches or 35 centimeters high. The floor underneath the ash, though, was undamaged. Now, wondering to himself, what in the blue smoke is going on here? He went upstairs to investigate. He found Dr. Bentley's bedroom smoky, and in the bathroom, he found the lower half of Dr. Bentley's right leg with the slipper still on it. The rest of his body was the pile of ashes in the basement below. Moses, brew. His walker lay across the hole in the floor generated by the fire. The rubber tips of the walker were still intact and the nearby bathtub was barely scorched. Don then ran from the building to get help. He then reached the gas company office screaming, quote, "Dr. Bentley's burned up." His colleagues would later state that he looked as white as a sheet. Well, what's the matter, Don? You never seen a man spontaneously combust before? No one has, actually, to be fair. Now, something else that was found in the bathroom was what seemed to be a broken water pitcher in the toilet. As for what could have happened, I will refer to Joe Nickell, an American skeptic, author, and general researcher and debunker of bullshit. He passed away in 2025. Now, in his book Secrets of the Supernatural, he mentions an account of this event that he got from Larry E. Arnold, a researcher and writer who spent decades trying to convince others that spontaneous human combustion is real and that Dr. Bentley was a victim of it. Well, based on what Arnold told Nickell theorized that Bentley had set himself on fire accidentally. He deduced this because Bentley's smoldering robe was found in the bathtub next to the hole. And of course, there was what was apparently a water pitcher in the toilet. Therefore, he believed that Bentley had dropped hot ash from his pipe onto his clothing, which were dotted with burn spots from previous incidents. Now, apparently, something that was known about him is that he often kept wooden matches in his pockets, which obviously could turn a small flame into a bigger one. Therefore, Joe Nickell believes that Bentley woke up to find his clothes on fire. He rushed to the bathroom and unfortunately passed out before he could extinguish the flames. Then his burning clothes probably ignited the flammable linoleum floor, and then this fire was able to keep burning by drawing cool air from the basement in what is known as the stack effect. Interesting, but there are two things to remember going forward. One just being Dr. John Irving Bentley, and the second thing is the sweet smell in the air that Don Gosnell smelled. Alright, you got it. Did you write it down? Don't need to, I'll probably bring it up again later. The next case is easily one of the weirdest ones, and this one happened in 1980 and to a guy named Henry Thomas, a 73-year-old Welshman who was sitting in his easy chair when he somehow caught fire from the waist up. Now, apparently, I know I sound like the apparently kid meme.
Well, it was great because apparently you're spinning around and apparently every time you get dizzy. And apparently I've never been on live television before.
Because honestly, it's hard to know what the facts are here. But apparently, on the evening of January 5th, Henry's next door neighbor went into his back garden and noticed a nasty smelling smoke coming from Henry's chimney. He assumed though that Henry was just burning trash, like his copy of Black Ops 7 and his M. Night Shyamalan Blu-rays. And so he just thought nothing more of it. The next morning, however, the smell was still there, and so he called the police. Now here is a recreation of what the Popo found. Fortunately this time, we do have a pretty detailed report from a police officer who was able to view the scene. This police officer said, quote, "The ashes lay on a rug and a foam-backed fitted carpet, both of which were only burned when they were in contact with the ashes. The charred portion of the rug and carpet was saturated in melted human fat. I later discovered that on the floor under the fitted carpet were thermoplastic tiles. A hot saucepan placed on such tiles would leave a permanent mark on the surface. When the carpet was removed and the floor was washed, there was no sign to be found to show that any heat had been applied to the tiles. They were all unblemished. The charring of the carpet extended for only an inch or so beyond the boundary of the ashes. The only inanimate and rarely flammable object in the room to have actually burned, apart from the charring of the carpet, was the wooden-framed easy chair in which the victim had been sitting when he started to burn. This chair was mostly reduced to ash, with the exception of part of the right-hand side of the wooden frame. The left-hand side burned through, and Henry's body then fell to the floor. Interestingly, part of the fabric cushioning was also unburned. In the fire grate lay the dead ashes of a coal fire containing a quantity of partially burnt coals. On the hearth lay a bundle of sticks ready for the laying of a fresh fire. On the front of the hearth lay Thomas's plastic framed spectacles. They were also undamaged. The front edge of the tiled hearth, a few inches from the ashes, was blackened with smoke. The surface of the hearth was clean and tidy. There were no signs of any coals having fallen from the fire. This fire had apparently gone out through the lack of attention, though there were plenty of unburned coals in the grate." End quote. Pretty weird. Now, after a couple of police officers came out to see this, the control room officer called a guy named John E. Hamer, a crime scene officer, and told him to go check this place out for himself. Hamer noted that there was a very strange yeasty smell in the room and an unseasonable warmth. Quote, "Hours after the body had been reduced to ash, the room was still radiating heat. The amount of heat released in that room must have been terrific. The walls were still radiating sufficient heat to make the house comfortably warm, even though it had no insulation or double glazing, or even central heating, and was situated near a mountaintop." End quote. John Hamer then photographed the scene and took note of the particulars. Afterwards, Hamer went back to the police station to call for the forensic scientist, and while there, a young police constable told Hamer that he was convinced it was a case of spontaneous human combustion, and he then showed Hamer a copy of Worldwide Mysteries that he had received for Christmas, which had a photograph of the 1966 case of Dr. John Irving Bentley. Hamer went on to say, quote, "Everyone who attended that incident either believes it to have been spontaneous human combustion, or, in the very least, does not believe it to have resulted from the ordinary process of combustion. It is my contention that spontaneous human combustion is an umbrella term covering 4 different and separate phenomena, of which 2 are different types of spontaneous human combustions." Huh? One which is always fatal and one which the victim can survive. The 4 separate phenomena are briefly: 1. The Wick effect. 2. Spontaneous human combustion where the victim is reduced to ashes. 3. The flameless type of spontaneous human combustion, which seems to attack only parts of the body. And 4. Static electric flash burns. End quote. However, not everybody was convinced. The forensic scientists, for example, weren't very convinced, and they said to John Hamer, "You do realize that spontaneous human combustion is a proven impossibility, right? There has to be a source of ignition. We are not living in the Marvel Cinematic Universe." Anyway, Henry's post-mortem revealed carbon monoxide in the blood of the remaining muscle tissue, suggesting that he inhaled the smoke from the fire, meaning he was still alive when he started burning. And the official explanation was that Henry had somehow fallen and landed headfirst in the fireplace, as evidenced by a small scrap of charred fibrous material sticking to the top fire bar of the grate. He must have then got back up, sat back down in his armchair, and then just proceeded to burn to death. Yeah, the inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. Yeah, the ending to that story is very fucking strange. Well, some people theorize that it was his hair that caught fire and he sat back down and he had no idea, but it's hard to imagine that he didn't at least notice, there's something warm up on my head. I don't remember putting a hat on this morning. But he seems to have caught fire somehow. Moving on. I got another really weird one now that comes from London in 1982, when a 61-year-old woman named Jeanie Saffin started roaring like a dragon in her kitchen. That's actually how her brother-in-law described it. Now, Jeanie was born with learning difficulties, and it's said that this limited her cognitive function to the level of a child. Now, apparently at the time of the incident, she was sitting in the kitchen with her father and her brother-in-law. According to the family, Jeanie's dad looked away from her for just a second, and when he looked back, she was on fire and had flames coming out of her mouth and made roaring noises like a dragon. Dad and brother-in-law then put the fire out quickly using water from the kitchen, called for an ambulance, and rushed Jeanie to the hospital. She was treated there for 8 days until she died of bronchopneumonia due to burns. And that really sucks. But to make it all worse, there is of course drama. Because what's a mystery without a little bit of embellishment, misunderstanding, or straight up fucking lying? Now, both her dad and brother-in-law claimed that before Jeanie burst into flames, there was no source of ignition in the kitchen, except the pilot light on the gas stove. A pilot light, by the way, provides a continuous small flame. Anyway, brother-in-law also supposedly claimed that Jeannie's clothes were unburned and that there was no smoke damage in the kitchen. Now, I don't know if you remember this fucking guy, John E. Hamer. Yeah, he suddenly changed careers now, became a paranormal author, and wrote the book The Entrancing Flame, citing this case of Jeanie Saffin as proof of spontaneous human combustion. However, it seems that details of this story are incorrect. Research by Mr. Joe Nickell suggests that Jeannie's clothes were actually very burnt, and found in a written statement given at the time of her death, 12 years before the interview conducted with John E. Hamer. Brother-in-law stated that Jeannie's clothes were severely burnt. So this fucking idiot just goes and makes up details and lies about what witnesses saw to prove that spontaneous human combustion is real, when all you're proving is that you're a cunt. And this is exactly why you cannot trust a paranormal author, investigator, or researcher, because they will lie, manipulate, embellish, and fake things, and for what reason?
Money! He always needs money!
What a bunch of fucking losers. Anyway, rant over. Now, if a blatant lie is not enough, police reports also indicated that when Jeannie arrived at the hospital, the police constables saw that her clothes were burning and they removed them. Furthermore, you know shit's about to get serious when the historian says furthermore. The claim of the fire coming out of her mouth also seems to be bullshit, because according to the hospital records, her mouth was undamaged. So what I want to know now is who said she was roaring like a dragon? Now, the same hospital and medical records also support the conclusion that the majority of her burns were the result of contact with burning or melted nylon from her clothing. So then, obviously, the question is, what started the fire then? Was it the pilot light? Well, unlikely. People have been able to deduce, based on interviews with Jeannie's dad, that at the time of the incident, his tobacco pipe was unlit and filled with fresh tobacco. According to Joe Nickell, Jeannie's dad probably knocked out some of the used tobacco from his pipe in order to refill it, and while doing that, he caused lit embers of the pipe tobacco to land on Jeannie's clothing. Now, at the time she burst into flames, the kitchen window and the door were also open, causing a cross breeze in the kitchen. Therefore, pipe embers, carried by the breeze, landed on her highly flammable nylon clothing, which were easily set on fire and were the main cause of her burns. Either way, relatives suggested at the inquest that her death could have been a case of spontaneous human combustion, but the coroner, Dr. John Burton, said, quote, "There is no such thing," and gave an open verdict. Here's a couple more quick ones for you. In 1985, a 17-year-old student named Jacqueline Fitzsimon from Cheshire was walking arm in arm with some friends down the stairs at her college when suddenly, for no apparent reason, she just burst into flames. A passerby said she was, quote, "like a stuntman on TV. The flames simply engulfed her," end quote. So it seems that youngsters were not spared of this phenomena. The next story comes from a firefighter named Jack Stacey, who found a guy named Robert Francis Bailey, a homeless man, burnt to death in a derelict building in Lambeth, London. When Jack Stacey described the scene, he said that Robert Bailey had a 4 or 5 inch slit in his stomach and a blue flame was coming out of that like a blowtorch. Very interesting. Now, something to remember about this incident is the blue fire. Now, the historic stuff is cool and all, but what the fuck did they know back then anyway? They didn't have Wikipedia. What do coroners today think? Wow. The most recentest case of spontaneous human combustion happened in Ireland in 2010. A 76-year-old man named Michael Faherty was found with severe burns lying on his back with his head near an open fireplace. Once again, there was very little damage done to the room, except for the ceiling directly above and the floor directly below his body being charred. When the forensic investigators came to inspect the scene, they did figure out that Michael Faherty suffered from type 2 diabetes and hypertension, but because his body was so badly burnt, they couldn't figure out exactly what caused his death. Another thing that these forensic investigators could determine was that no accelerants had been used, and the fireplace was not linked to his death. With that said though, based on not understanding what the fuck had happened here, the coroner blamed this whole thing on the supernatural, and he said, quote, "This fire was thoroughly investigated, and I'm left with the conclusion that this fits into the category of spontaneous human combustion, for which there is no adequate explanation." End quote. Even in the year 2010, you could become a coroner knowing absolutely fuck all. A little while later though, in September 2011, another better coroner formed an inquiry into the death and told everyone involved that he had scoured medical literature and found that a high number of these alleged incidents of spontaneous human combustion had shockingly happened near an open fireplace or a chimney, or a place with an open flame. And then people began to question why the original coroner just ruled out all of the other possibilities, because there seems to be a pattern here. He probably ruled out all the other possibilities because it was almost lunchtime and fuck this. Now on to the last one, and arguably the most popular case of spontaneous human combustion, Mary Reeser. Now at about 8 p.m. on the evening of June 1st, 1951, Dr. Richard Reeser went to visit his mother Mary in her apartment in St. Petersburg, Florida. Richard and his daughter found Mary settled into her armchair, getting ready to call it a night. At the end of the visit, Mary told them that she was going to take 2 sleeping pills, change into her nightgown, and then smoke a cigarette before going to bed. Well, hey, a lot of smokers in the story, and a lot of people bursting into flames. I'm sure it's just another one of those coincidences that we keep coming across. But this would be the last time that anyone saw Mary Reeser alive. So it's kind of sad. The next morning, on June 2nd at about 8 a.m., Mary's landlady named Pansy Carpenter arrived at Mary's apartment with a telegram. Telegrams are how the dinosaurs used to communicate. Pansy knocked on the door, but nobody answered. She then, for some reason, noticed that the doorknob was unusually hot, so she called the police. Well, when the police arrived at the apartment, they found that the room was completely filled with smoke, and some embers were still flickering on an overhead beam. In the middle of the room, they discovered a pile of ashes where Mary's armchair used to be. Within the pile, they found the chair's coil springs, part of Mary's spine. They also found Mary's left foot, which was still wearing her black slipper, and there was a roundish object left behind, which was believed to be her skull, which people like to say shrank to the size of a teacup. Spoiler alert, it probably didn't shrink, but we'll come back to that in a second. Well, we know how weird this shit is, so it's no surprise that the St. Pete's police chief took one look at the pile of ashes, said, "You know what? This shit is above my pay grade," and sent the box of ashes to the FBI, saying, quote, "Let Scully and Mulder figure this shit out." The FBI then said, "What in the blue hell is this? Easy mode?" Mary Reeser was obviously incinerated by the Wick effect. They were able to deduce this because they knew that Mary had taken sleeping pills that night. So they hypothesized that she had just fallen unconscious while smoking and she had set fire to her nightgown with her cigarette. The police report of that night says that she was wearing a rayon acetate nightgown, which is highly flammable, and the FBI said, quote, "Once the body starts to burn, there is enough fat and other inflammable substances to permit varying amounts of destruction to take place." Inflammable, ironically meaning very flammable. Sometimes this destruction by burning will proceed to a degree which results in almost complete combustion of the body. End quote. They even found melted fats by Mary's remains, backing this theory up. Now, we've only looked at a few cases out of the 200-ish, but in general, there are some obvious patterns and similarities in these cases that may help us understand what in the blue flame and smoke and hell is going on here. And that is that all of these people have been the victims of the Wick effect. However, some people don't like their precious paranormal phenomena to be explained with practical and rational answers, and skeptics of the Wick effect have raised a few questions. And they're actually pretty good questions. Firstly, they question why the rest of the apartment or rooms don't go up in flames as well. Actually a very good question. Well, when interviewed by a local newspaper, Mary Reeser's daughter-in-law said, quote, "The cigarette dropped into her lap, her fat was the fuel that kept her burning, the floor was cement, and the chair was by itself. There was nothing around her to burn." End quote. Now fair enough, this may only be relevant in the case of Mary Reeser, because we know some of the other people were on carpets or straw mattresses apparently. But we cannot forget that the chairs that these victims were sitting on disintegrated as well. In the case of Dr. Bentley, the fucking floor disintegrated. So this fire is not exclusively burning just the victim. But the fact is that it does not spread. So why is that? Well, with the Wick effect, the smoldering fire concentrates damage on the torso, where most of the body fat is found, while the extremities with less fat and less clothing are not affected. Then, with a lack of oxygen and an intense, low flame, this keeps the fire from spreading like a typical room fire. The second question is how, in the blue flame, are these people completely cremated if the rest of the apartment was just fine? And the third question we can look at the same time. How is cremation even possible when a typical fire can only reach a maximum temperature of 2000 degrees Fahrenheit? Wow. You can run this scientific experiment for yourself and type this into Google. How long to cremate bones in a 2000 F fire? The answer that you will get is about 2 to 3 hours. You can also run this experiment. How hot are crematorium ovens? The answer that you will get this time is between 1400 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we run the two tests together. How long does it take a crematorium to cremate a body? Bizarrely, the answer that you will get this time is about 2 to 3 hours. No, hold on. That does sound strangely familiar. And that's because that's how long it takes to cremate bones in 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, which a typical fire can actually reach. Now, since we know that about 12 hours had elapsed since Mary Reeser was last seen alive and when she was discovered, technically she had enough time to be cremated 4 times over. Next question, how did her skull shrink? Simple, it didn't. This is from the Skeptical Inquirer, quote, "The self-styled bone detective, who is often quoted on the subject, merely referred to a second-hand account and thus spoke of a roundish object identified as the head. Actually, as a forensic anthropologist theorized at our request, Mary Reese's skull probably burst in the fire and was destroyed, and this roundish object could have merely been a globular lump that can result from the musculature of the neck where it attaches to the base of the skull." End quote. And now for the final question. What converts a watery human being of non-combustible fat and flesh into a furnace? Well, according to professor, scientist, author, and researcher Brian J. Ford, one factor that has been overlooked by everyone is acetone. Now, interestingly, acetone in small quantities burns blue, and it also smells sweet, like a fruity sweet solvent. Now, how does acetone come into play? Well, according to Brian J. Ford, quote, "When reviewing the victims of spontaneous human combustion, I discern a single factor that they might all have in common. Some, but not all, were alcoholics. Some, but not all, were overweight. Some, but not all, were old and enfeebled. Some, but not all, smoked cigarettes. But they all seem to have been unwell. In many cases, like alcoholism, blood glycogen levels become depleted. Cells now can no longer rely upon conventional energy resources, and fat molecules are used instead as an energy source. Big words incoming, triacylglycerol lipids cleave to provide fatty acid chains and a glycerol molecule. What? If the body cells suffer starvation, which can occur during chronic illness or even during a workout at the gym, acetyl-CoA in the liver is translated into acetoacetate, and this can decarboxylate into acetone. What the fuck? Now that was a lot of big words, but the main takeaway is that your body produces acetone. Moving on, the cells of the brain, for example, cannot access long-chain fatty acids as an energy source, but they can use ketone bodies, and acetone is one of the 3 ketone bodies produced by the human body. The odor of acetone can be detected on the breath. However, acetone on the breath is natural, and it isn't only present in breath. It can be found throughout the human body. Acetone infuses with layers of fat and collects in the folds of clothing, and all the while, acetone is highly inflammable. Now, Brian J. Ford goes on to suggest that in very, very, very rare circumstances, spontaneous human combustion may hypothetically work a little like this. Static electricity, produced when removing garments made of synthetic fibers or when brushing one's hair, can discharge at 50,000 volts. Can probably being the key word there. Acetone vapor in air is liable to explode if exposed to a spark of this sort. Industrial bottles have a warning label to remind users to avoid any chance of a discharge of static electricity. Acetone will automatically ignite at 465 degrees Celsius. Alcohol ignites at 362 degrees Celsius. Now, for comparison of these two different chemicals, the flash point of alcohol is 13 degrees Celsius. A flash point is the lowest temperature at which a vapor can burn. So alcohol is 13 degrees Celsius, acetone is negative 17 degrees Celsius. Therefore, it seems like this shit could just ignite anywhere. And Brian Ford concludes with, "It seemed to me that acetone might offer an alternative theory for spontaneous human combustion." Now, Brian J. Ford has done some experiments with miniatures, and say what you want about how the video experiments look, Brian Ford has stated quite clearly in his paper that, quote, "I do not find my experiments to be conclusively detailed, but they are certainly far better than those on which all existing scientific knowledge has been based," end quote. Either way, these photos look pretty similar to the aftermath of a lot of these cases. So the prevailing theory is that spontaneous human combustion is impossible. Something must be igniting these people, and then something must keep them burning. This is what the Wick effect tries to explain. The theory states that a person is kept burning through their own fats after being ignited, accidentally or otherwise. The clothed human body then acts like an inside-out candle, with the fuel source being the human fat on the inside and the wick being the clothing which is soaking up the victim's fat on the outside. Therefore, there is a continuous supply of fuel in the form of melting fat seeping into the victim's clothing. Now, in most cases, there seems to be some plausible sort of way the victims have caught fire, like smoking or being close to a fireplace or a pilot light or whatever. However, no conclusive evidence remains behind. This is probably because shit like cigarette butts are getting incinerated as well, or the demon from hell escapes this horrible place we call the earth back through his portal to hell. That said though, Brian J. Ford's experiment shows that it's technically possible that some of these people could have been ignited from acetone being on their breath or on their clothing, with as little as a static discharge. So that's pretty fucking scary. Thank the fuck he does not find his experiments conclusive. But based on Brian Ford's observations, why some of the limbs remain behind is that when the victim is ignited, either while asleep or just sitting there doing nothing about it, the fire smolders slowly and then eventually eats through the chair that they're sitting on. And then the victim collapses outwards, with the pool of melted fat focused in the center, cutting off their limbs. And you know what? That's about enough of that. Fucking hell. Speaking about all of this shit is starting to make me feel ill. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on the Wick effect. Can we say that this one is solved, or is this still a mystery? I don't know. But what I do know is that I'm gonna go take a Pepto-Bismol, because what in the blue fucking smoking hell did we just struggle through together?